Due north of San Francisco is a 1.7-mile-long bridge with towers nearly 750 feet tall. It is one of the West Coast's signature monuments with an iconic color and scenic view. Despite its popularity, or perhaps a part of it, was its complicated construction that some deemed to be outright impossible. Today, we discover the Golden Gate Bridge. California had seen many Northerners enter the territory to get their hands dirty looking for gold, and just as many Southerners who brought slaves with them to do the work. So during the Civil War, San Francisco was heavily armored by the US government, particularly at Lime Point and Fort Point, the narrowest strait at the entrance of the San Francisco harbor. It had become such a vulnerable point of the West Coast that the government was genuinely concerned the British would attempt to annex it during the chaos of the Civil War. Towards the end of the Civil War, the Union drastically scaled up the defense of San Francisco and all of California to prevent a raid in the dwindling days of the Confederacy. And this period saw a lot of changes to communication. Information that once reached California in 12 days via the Pony Express now arrived in a moment by telegraph. And such was the case with the Appomattox Courthouse Treaty. San Francisco exploded in celebration upon hearing the news, but within a week, this celebration took a horrible turn as the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln reduced the city to complete and utter chaos. A newspaper office with pro-Confederate sympathies found itself ransacked by a loyalist mob. These same groups attacked citizens in the street at even a hint of Confederate allegiances. In the end, the military stationed in Fort Alcatraz marched into San Francisco to restore order, breaking up riots and punishing anyone who dared to celebrate the president's death. That same fort would fire half-hourly cannon shots in mourning of the late Lincoln. Despite the Civil War, the Transcontinental Railroad would be completed in 1869, finally linking California with the rest of the country. By then, the mouth of the San Francisco Bay had taken on a new name, reflecting the endless wealth that poured out of the lucrative trade point and the rush that made the area what it was. The strait between Lime Point and Fort Point became known by a now iconic name, the Golden Gate. For years, many living in the area proposed a bridge across the Golden Gate, but at the time, it was simply impossible. This hypothetical bridge was brought up so often that it became known as the bridge that couldn't be built. As a 1.7-mile-long bridge over turbulent water would be a monumental task, even in the safest areas. One could describe the Golden Gate Strait with many words, but safe was not among them. Strong tides, wind, and blinding fog all posed serious dangers. Not to mention the San Andreas Fault just 7 miles offshore. The Golden Gate was quite literally one of the worst conditions a bridge could find a home. Until the turn of the 20th century, the bridge that couldn't be built remained only a concept, as an estimation pricing it at $100 million continued to put it out of the reach of a war-torn United States. That was until an engineer named Joseph Behrman Strauss came forward with a plan to build budgeted just between $25 and $30 million. Strauss was a native Ohioan and graduate of the University of Cincinnati. He was fascinated with bridges, even proposing a bridge across the Bering Strait to link Alaska with Russia as his senior thesis. And when he heard of an undoable bridge across the Golden Gate, he immediately got to work. His final design was a suspension bridge that the city decided would become a reality in January of 1933. As part of the Golden Gate Bridge construction, the military decommissioned Fort Point Light in September of 1934, as it was directly beneath the bridge. However, the Lime Point Light on the north side of the bridge remained strategically valuable. Starting as a fog bell signal station in the Civil War, it gained a lighthouse at the turn of the 20th century, remaining active even after the bridge's completion, as the structure did not compromise its location. By 1961, the Coast Guard automated the system and tore down the remaining buildings. One of the biggest challenges of the construction was the work taking place underwater, as the bridge's south tower was over 1,100 feet from the shore and had to have a harbor constructed at its base before the team could even think about getting anything done. Starting construction of the south tower was precarious, as divers had to dive 110 feet into the Golden Gate Strait, placing dynamic charges to clear the way to the bedrock, and later guide the forms and funnels that would place the fender. The strait's merciless, dark and murky water in an ice-cold abyss of angry current and tides provided diving to be one of the most dangerous parts of the project. And on top of it all, portable air tanks were still a thing of the future. Air was supplied through a hose from the surface to the diver's helmet. If that little hose snapped or the air pump stopped, the diver's life would be lost. By the time the foundation was completed, the harbor was no longer sufficient. So workers constructed a roadway on a wooden trestle to the shore to allow construction equipment to cross the water. However, it was too exposed to the ocean and didn't have any signal equipment. So 1933 saw both a freighter collide with the road and a storm tearing down repair efforts within 2 months of one another. The workers continued regardless, rolling with the punches and reconstructing the trestle as needed. However, the South Tower wouldn't need to survive any collisions. To protect it, the workers built a massive concrete barrier around the base. Any ships would just collide with the fender, leaving the tower unscathed. The fender was made beneath the water level by routing concrete tubes to a wooden form, allowing it to set. Upon its completion, workers affectionately called it a giant bathtub, since it was still filled with water. After emptying this so-called 9.4 million gallon bathtub, workers reinforced it with steel and even more concrete. With the fender in place and the concrete work done, the team completed the steel part of the tower in 6 months. A suspension bridge of this size was simply unheard of before. At the time of its construction, the two towers, each 746 feet tall, were the tallest bridge towers in the world. They were so massive that they required cranes placed on platforms along 2 legs. The 44,000 tons of steel were shipped from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania through the newly opened Panama Canal and went up these platforms to find their place in the structure taller than a 60-story building. With both towers now completed, the main cables went up next. At 3 feet in diameter, these cables turned out to be 12,000 tons each. For a little context, if they were placed on a simple barge, that barge would sink in an instant. The construction team decided to use a process called cable spinning to build them. They strung up a pencil-thick wire to the towers, then did the same thing in the opposite direction. They repeated this until all of the 27,572 wires were in place, at which point they pressed the strands into a single, much thicker wire. The process took 6 months total, which set a new world record for speed and efficiency. With the suspension set, it was now time to hang the roadway. The triangular trusses kept the deck steady against the wind, with vertical suspenders holding it in place. The construction team built the roads from the towers until meeting in the middle. The final roadway deck was placed on April the 19th, 1937, marking the end of construction. And as universal as the bridge has become, there's also a mysterious shipwreck beneath it that most people don't even know about. Before the construction of the bridge, there was a disaster at the Golden Gate Strait. On August the 22nd, 1888, at 10 a.m., a steamboat known as the City Chester was exiting the San Francisco Bay. At the same time, the steamship Oceanic was arriving from Hong Kong. The ships acknowledged one another and attempted to navigate away from one another, but fate had a different idea. A tidal current caught the smaller vessel, drawing it directly into the Oceanic. The Oceanic nearly ripped the City Chester in half upon collision, and the ship sank just 6 minutes later, taking with it 16 passengers, 2 of which were children, and 3 crew members also died in the wreck. The U.S. Coast Guard dragged wires through the water to find wreckage, but to no avail. It remained lost, and even became forgotten as the Golden Gate Bridge went up above it. For 120 years, it would lie there, silent, until May 2013, when a Coast Survey response team came upon the wreckage using sonar, just 400 feet from where they estimated it might be. It still lies there today, mostly intact and keeping much of its form from when it once sailed the waters.